Ever play one of those games that annoys the hell out of you, that you have a million and one complaints about, and that you swore you'd never play again after a particularly frustrating sequence made you rage quit? Except you keep coming back to it because, at the end of the day, you kind of enjoyed playing it. Yeah, I can think of a handful of games like that, and Dark Void is one of them. Dark Void is a third-person shooter slash third-person flight sim that does neither particularly well. In fact, it doesn't do much of anything well. The story is... well, to be honest, I didn't understand much of the story. You're some pilot who crashes in the Bermuda Triangle and ends up somewhere in a parallel universe, which is ruled by some aliens or something, who are viewed as gods by those native to that parallel universe, and you and a whole slew of others trapped in this parallel universe have to battle the aliens to return home. Or something. I'm convinced that the story is total crap and nonsensical, but since I had a hard time following it, it may just be me. What is noteworthy about the story is that the game tries hard to tell it in an interesting way. Of course, in so doing, it totally rips off the Uncharted series. There's even a love interest that looks eerily similar to Chloe Fraser from the Uncharted series, except without any of the spunk or panache or sex appeal or character. She's really bland, and the banter between her and your character is almost painful to listen to. And that's pretty much true of both Dark Void's story and the storytelling. Though it borrows heavily from the Uncharted series in that Dark Void features lots of cutscenes and banter between characters and flashbacks and has a strong cinematic quality and an unconventional and semi-out-of-sequence narrative structure, it lacks something that made following the story and watching cutscenes and listening to dialogue a hoot in both Uncharted games. Dark Void's story is just plain drab. None of the characters are remotely interesting, and the storytelling technique it borrows from the Uncharted series does nothing to distract from the flimsy and overblown plot. I usually don't criticize story in games because most games have crap stories, but there's quite a bit of it and it's hard to overlook. In fact, there was one chapter of 12 total chapters in which all you do is follow this other character and listen to the dialogue between him and your character. That's all you do, run around behind this guy and listen to him and your character talk. I guess it served to move the plot forward and fill the players in on some of the background story, but it's just a poorly executed sequence and a horrible way of advancing the plot. Thankfully, the chapter is only 10 or so minutes long, but there's a lot of this kind of bad design or whatever throughout the game. The third-person flight sim portion of the game is a prime example of this. It takes quite a bit of getting used to. It may be just that I'm using mouse and keyboard and those playing on a gamepad experience none of my frustrations, but I don't think it's strictly the choice of controller that determines your experience. The main problem is that there's no sense of gravity working against you. It feels more like a space flying simulation than an atmosphere-based flying simulation. And since the game isn't a flight simulation, this lack of gravity when flying is something I can easily forgive, except it does make flying about extremely disorienting. In a space flying simulation, it pretty much doesn't matter which way you're facing. There's no ground or trees or mountains to worry about. In fact, there's no such thing as up or down or north or south or east or west. You just chase your target and shoot it down. But in an atmosphere-based flight simulation, there's a strong need to know which direction you're facing. It's especially important to know whether you're facing up or down. Now, visual cues are certainly the primary means in determining which direction you're facing. If you see clouds, you're probably climbing. However, when you're in the midst of a hectic dogfight and you're locked on a target, it's not always easy to tell by means of visual cues where you're situated. That's when that sense of gravity working against you when climbing or working with you when falling really helps. But this game feels like you're in a constant state of inertia. It doesn't matter if you're climbing or falling, there's no difference in feel between the two. And it's a problem when there are tons of objects about you that you can crash into. But you do get used to it after a while, and it can be pretty fun to play despite the awkwardness and the frustrations with the controls. You have a primary fire, machine gun, and secondary fire, rockets. And there are special moves like rolling left or right, or doing a 180 to face the other direction almost instantly, assigned to keys, which I'm sure flight sim purists will scoff at because that's what they do, they scoff. But it's kind of necessary for this game because you're not going to be playing the game with a flight sim. What made the flying fun for me is that you're tasked to accomplish a variety of things depending on mission, like eliminating all enemies or taking out turrets or escorting a giant blimp-like thingy, and you're given the freedom to go about accomplishing them in different ways. And by different ways, I mean there's more than one way to skin a cat. It's not just about aiming with crosshairs and clicking your left or right mouse button and doing that until everyone's dead. You can also climb inside a nearby turret and take out enemies that way. You can also latch onto an enemy spaceship and try to overtake the controls. Doing that leads you to a minigame, which isn't all that great, but it does serve to break up the monotony of straightforward and not particularly well done dogfighting. And it's this sense of variety that serves the game well throughout. The rest and the bulk of the game is a third-person cover shooter, and the shooting is pretty standard fare and quite mediocre. You fight these robot-like thingies, and I realized in fighting them that a lot of shooters are actually just as mediocre as Dark Void, but they mask their mediocrity with lots of blood and gore. I kinda missed the blood and gore in this game, especially when the shooting is kind of weak. What do I mean by weak? Well, it takes about 20 ammo from your laser gun thingy to take down a single low-tier foot soldier robot. It actually only takes 4 or 5 hits to take it down, but the game has the enemies doing some sort of animation whenever they hit, and none of your bullets you shoot while they're doing their ouch I'm hit animation connect. So you could either shoot incessantly until they die and waste about 20 ammo, or you could shoot once, wait for their ouch I'm hit animation to stop, and then shoot and continue doing this until you hit them about 4 or 5 times. The second part makes more sense, of course, because you conserve ammo that way, but that's just too fucking boring. And if it were just a straightforward third-person shooter, with the enemies going from cover to cover, and there is artificial cover like fences and crates everywhere, even in places where it makes no logical sense for the enemy to provide artificial cover for themselves. And with the enemies always leaving a bit of themselves exposed at all times, this game would be boring, but it's not. And it's mostly because you have this ability to hover above ground, and you can traverse the map anyhow you want. You can do the conventional thing and go from cover to cover on foot, or you can hover about and use height to your advantage and pour your rain of bullets from above. Unfortunately, the enemies seem to have no trouble hitting you from below. Or you can use your hover ability to close gaps quickly, since hovering about is faster than running, plus you don't have to run around objects. And that's where most of the fun lies, traversing the terrain in a variety of ways. Unlike most games, Dark Void features a real, viable 3D terrain. While in most games you have very few reasons to shoot up or down, thus rendering the game for all intents and purposes two-dimensional, Dark Void actually makes use of 3D. Some enemies have the ability to hover above ground, and there are often enemies situated above or below you. It's fun hovering about and either dogging out in the air or jumping up to the 3rd or 4th floor and pounding on the enemies there. And that's the clincher, at least for me. You can punch the robot thingies. Okay, the punching mechanics are way too simplistic and a bit ridiculous, but because it takes about 4 or 5 shots from your laser gun thingy to take down a foot soldier robot, but it only takes 1 punch to knock it dead? That's ridiculous. And the punching is just a matter of getting within punching distance and pressing a key, at which point the game shows an animated sequence of your character punching or destroying an enemy with no further input from you required, and certainly no aim or skill. And this would normally be a big turnoff for me because you're not involved in the actual killing, but because the game is so much more about getting around and getting to your enemies than actually killing them, the act of getting to the enemy and punching them to death is fun as a whole. In fact, it's so much more fun than the comparatively drab shooting, and far more effective since it takes only 1 or 2 punches to take down most enemies, that you'll be doing this for 90% of the game, at least the third-person shooting portions of the game. There's also sequences in which you're climbing cliffs or sides of buildings and you're hanging onto ledges, placed conveniently for you to grab onto and use as cover, with enemies doing the same and shooting at you. It's not all that different from the regular cover shooting mechanic in the game, except you're vertically aligned instead of horizontally, but it's kind of fun to do once in a while just because it breaks up the monotony. Overall, the game has superb pacing. There's just a lot of variety in mission types, such as clearing all the enemies in an area, or escorting someone from point A to B, or finding items, or holding your ground while a barrage of enemies rush at you incessantly. Plus the game mixes things up with the flying and the shooting, and shows you cutscenes at just the right time. Okay, boring cutscenes, but timely cutscenes nevertheless, that the game rarely feels too repetitious. The game has received many negative reviews, and there sure are a lot to complain about. I didn't even mention some of my biggest complaints about the game, but there are times when a list of complaints doesn't do a game justice. Many reviews have compared Dark Void to other third-person shooters like Gears of War, and they've done so rather unfavorably. But besides the lack of blood and gore, I don't think the third-person cover shooting aspect of Dark Void is all that different from Gears. And some have said it's better to wait for Mass Effect 2 to be released. Sure, ME2 will be a better game and have a far more satisfying third-person cover shooting mechanic, but ME2 will be a contender for Game of the Year, so a lot of games will pale in comparison to it. All I know is, despite the millions of flaws in the game, in answering the following question honestly, did you enjoy playing the game? I'd have to say, yeah, I kind of did.